Hello and welcome to another Shaper Sessions, the perfect place to join us to learn things about Shaper origin, do project builds, and hear from the people that know the tool best. Today I'm joined by my coworker Sean.
Hello, everybody. I'm out here in Oakland as normal.
And as well, we have a special guest with us today. We have illustrator and printmaker Orlie Kapitulnik joining us.
Hi, folks. I'm in San Francisco over in the inner sunset.
All right. So, as you may be able to tell, today we are focusing on block printing, stamp making, and we have brought someone in that knows a lot more than we know. But we're going to all learn about it together today. So, Orly, would you mind kind of running us through the basics of printmaking and block printing and what we're about to get into today?
Yeah, you bet. I'm a block printer, which means I carve my designs into blocks of linoleum and blocks of wood. That process is so old, but we continue to do it today. It's basically what we're doing is we're creating a graphic that we can reproduce very easily. So we carve it by hand using woodblock carving tools, or maybe more well known are these speedball carving tools. And we carve into, in my case, I mostly use linoleum, creating my image that I start off as an illustration. So I transfer it to a block of linoleum, I carve it, and then I use these presses to recreate the prints with some ink.
Awesome. All right. So for as far as the linoleum, I have here a couple different, a single type of linoleum, more of a hard-based linoleum with an MDF backing. That's what I'm going to be making my stamp out of today. You can see it's a thin layer of linoleum on top, backed by the MDF. This is going to be a quick on-tool hand stamp that I'm just going to do to kind of warm us up and get into the swing of it. I have my standard engraving bit in my origin, the one that comes with the tool, but I want to quickly talk about a couple of different options, especially once we get into the 1/8 inch collet territory. So if you hop over, let's just use this cam. I have a PCB bit that is a very sharp, so if I'm trying to get really fine details, I'm going to use that really sharp engraving bit with my 1/8 inch collet. But for right now, I am just going to stick with the standard engraving bit. It's got my linoleum double stick taped down, nice and secure. I'm not going to be cutting hard on this, so I'm not too worried about it breaking loose. I'm just going to be doing a light engraving and then a shallow outside pass. So let's start by doing some on-tool text. I want to create something that I can press onto my finished pieces, pointing out that it is in fact a Shaper-made piece. I've already set up my grid. I have a 1/16 inch grid. Go ahead and zoom out for you just to see what I'm working with. Bottom left grid, 1/16 inch intervals. Hop over into my Create tab and Text Basic. I've already typed it out, hashtag Shaper-made. I'm going to set my height to 1/4 inch. And zoom out a little bit. Just center that on my block. There you go. Those of you that have used on-tool text before, you know that it's an on-line cut, so it really doesn't matter what size or type of cutter I'm using. In this case, again, with the engraving bit, the deeper I go, the wider the kerf or the wider the letter is going to be. So I'm doing a really shallow cut. But before we jump into that, I'm going to next create a bit of a border because we're going to cut the letters out. I just caught something, and it's a mistake that we've made a couple of different times. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that, place this off to the side again. Because
yeah, so for those of you who haven't actually made a stamp or a block print with Origin or even in general, when you're building the block, you're actually cutting the reverse of what you want to show up on the piece. Because if you don't, what happens is you have a cut that ends up perfect on the thing you're going to print with. But then when you transfer it over to the paper, you get a reversed image. So on Origin, we're actually going to use the flipping functionality by scaling the file differently to be able to place that on Origin. So maybe if we cut back to Jake's camera, he can quickly show how to do that right on tool.
Okay, so I haven't placed my Shaper-made text yet, but I did place the one below it just so that I could grab it, make a copy, and now I have a copy that I'm moving around with. So I go into my Scale tab. First off, I want to unlink my 2 dimensions, and I want to flip it this way, so I'm changing that width to a negative. And bada bing, bada boom. It flips. So again, place that in the middle. Now it's backwards. I can go ahead and get rid of this down there. And now I can create my border.
And this is pretty important for kind of any shape you're going to be cutting a block print with, because you need to flip it before you cut it, otherwise it'll be the wrong way. And as Jake and I can tell you through testing this week, we have both done it incorrectly. So either you have a couple options there. You can invert the file before you export it to Origin through Shaper Hub or USB, or you can just flip it right on tool using that technique Jake just showed.
All right, looks like my rounded rectangle is nice and centered over my text. And I'm good to go. Now, I have yet to Z-touch with this engraving bit because I want to talk about it. My linoleum is on the soft side, so when you take a sharp bit and try to Z-touch on it, you got to keep a close eye on it because you risk actually indenting into that material. So especially that sharper bit that I showed you earlier, that's just going to pierce through the material. So you have to keep your eye on it and make sure that it's not going too deep. I think the stock engraving bit, because of the degree, is going to dive less into the soft material, but just something to be aware of. Z-touch, making sure that I'm going directly onto my material. I also have my material slightly below the surface of the workstation so that I'm sliding over the top of it. Okay. And now just to dial in the depth of cut, my depth is going to start high, and once I figure out exactly how I like my text to look, then I can roll through and do the rest of the text. So
yeah, and typically if you're doing a Z-touch on something this soft, you may actually need to start with a negative depth before you start working your way down, because if that point goes in, now your Z depth is actually lower than the surface. So for instance, I think I did one here and I ended up starting at negative 0.02 depth, which you would think is above the surface, but in this case, because it's a soft material, it'll be a little below it, and you can always go deeper. So it's always worth kind of doing quick test cut to see where it lands.
Exactly. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. And you know what? That actually just came out perfectly. I'm very happy with that depth. So I'm going to run through and engrave the rest of my stamp.
Okay, so while Jake's doing this, if you haven't seen us before, this is Shaper Origin. It's a handheld CNC that corrects while you're cutting to give you really fine, precise results. Now, what Jake's kind of showing is he's just going to walk through cutting each of these letters. It's a quick click. You might have seen he was actually using auto locked mode, which is instead of a single click to cut, you do a double click, and that'll actually do a very precise speed around, which can be set in the settings. That'll get you really nice kind of cut quality with all types of different materials, whether you're cutting wood, in this case linoleum, or even metals like brass and aluminum. And you can set that speed kind of in the bottom left. You'll see that speed icon. So that can be changed. Cutting linoleum is actually quite easy with Origin. I found doing some test cuts this week that it's one of the easier materials to cut. The only thing I would say is in general, when we're talking speeds and feeds, you're thinking rubber is going to melt if you cut with a spindle speed that's too fast. So really taking that spindle speed down to kind of a lower thing. We have a whole session on speeds and feeds, material settings that you can check later, which goes over how to cut different types of materials, what speeds, what types of bits, etc. In this case, Jake's just using the stock engraving bit that comes with Origin, and I found that they work quite well. Now, we're going to talk a little bit later about kind of what happens with the details of these things as you get more involved cuts, but we're going to start with this kind of simple stamp idea and just walk through that.
Right on. So when cutting a linoleum, especially if it's just a shallow cut, having a nice bristle brush like this is really handy because it just kind of scrubs out any of the dust, and I am very happy with that. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take that rounded rectangle that I made. I'm going to put a 1/4 inch upcut bit in there and just do a shallow pass on the outside so that this portion is what's raised up.
Yeah, and you'll notice here in this picture, Jake has actually left some space between the aluminum on workstation, the clamping face, and the piece. So when he does clear that edge, it won't actually hit the aluminum with the bit, which you need to be careful with. We also have, an ability to raise and lower the clamping face, so you can put spoil boards in there. But in this case, linoleum is really a soft material, so you don't have a lot of material forces going kind of laterally across the piece that's there. If you're cutting hardwood, you really want more of a backing or on the side and the back so that you have less chance of it moving. We kind of skipped over how he put it on there, but we sell double-sided tape in the store, which works really well. And that's just kind of, you lay it down on the shelf, stick it on top, and then raise it up until you kind of get really close to zero. I think Jake did mention, he actually didn't raise the shelf all the way up, because if you do that, the bottom of Origin's actually riding on the linoleum, and depending on if the base gets scratched up or you get something caught in there, it can damage the linoleum. So in this case, the workstation can lower it just enough where you have just a bit of air through there and you don't have to worry about connecting with it.
Yep. So I'm going to bump my offset out a bit because I want to get that corner of the linoleum gun. So I'll do this in 2 passes, one large and then the second one using my offset feature right up to my final line.
Yeah, and if you haven't seen Origin, you can use this offset to do a lot more than just cut your shape out. So in this case, instead of going to all the hassle of building a shape that fits the stamp perfectly and figuring out how to get around it, you can just offset that one path, cut it, retract, change the offset to 0, and then cut it again. One of the things we typically talk about when we're cutting wood is kind of what's the standard offset you should be using when you're cutting kind of these rough and finish passes. In wood, you can do a lot less. But what I found when we're cutting the linoleum is, because it's a lot softer than wood, if you're only taking a tiny little chip out of the linoleum, you won't actually get as clean of a cut. So here you can see Jake's actually doing, quite a big offset, maybe 1/8 of an inch or so, so that he can get a little more chip removed, or a single chip that gets removed, and then you'll get much cleaner finish on your stamps.
All right. So I'm quite happy with that. Just enough to where that when we ink that up, we're just pressing that down on the paper and not the border. But it also gives me a nice square reference, so if I'm trying to square it up to the bottom of my piece, I can use that as my reference line. So, somebody around to help me print this?
I think so.
Right.
Maybe you can hand this one off to Orlie and she can give it a go.
Right on. All right, I'll hand this over.
This looks great. This turned out so well. And you even remembered to inverse the text.
I almost messed that up, but thankfully we talked about it over and over again.
Yeah. So not only text, but also your graphic you want to inverse, because what happens is you've drawn something or designed something at a certain balance and you've seen it a certain way. And if you don't inverse it, even if it's something that is, just a funky creature or some line work, it's nice to have things look the way that you initially envisioned them, right?
Absolutely.
So let's ink this up, right?
Let's do it.
See what we got. Because it's smaller, I'm going to print it on the hand press that I have here. And I've got some ink rolled out here already. I'm using a Caligo ink. It's a safe wash, which means I can clean it up with some soap and water, but it's oil-based, which means I'm going to get a really nice, rich, kind of matte, inky coverage. Speedball is also pretty good. They have an oil-based as well, but I always go for Caligo. It's a Cranfield ink over there. So I've got my ink pad and I've got my ink well. I just take a little bit of ink and I put it down on my pad. I don't want to put too much because otherwise what will happen is I'll just get ink in all of those tiny little grooves that you've carved out so well. And I'm actually, when I'm rolling out the ink, I think you guys can hear it pretty well. There's like a really nice hiss. You want to hear kind of almost like the sound of Velcro, like a really fine Velcro.
Yeah, how do you know if it's kind of too much ink or not enough on the roller?
Yeah, so it's a sight and a sound thing. So when you've got too much ink on your pad, what's going to happen is it's gonna smack almost. You're going to see the pores of your ink. So when you roll it out, you can actually see that there's a texture to the ink that you've rolled out. You'll have these tiny, it's almost like denim or like the texture of like a lime. It's very tight pores. If it's too wet, what will happen is you'll see they're stretched. It's almost like they're being pulled, like, when you're painting a wall and you get these stretched kind of paint marks that are textured. Right. You want to veer away from that, and you want to, if that does happen, that's totally fine. You can always take ink away from your ink pad and adjust, and then kind of re-roll it out. So the trick is, it's the sound and the sight. So the sound is, like I said, a fine Velcro. My old boss, Eric, used to say it's like sizzling bacon, but I don't know what kind of bacon he was cooking, because when mine cooks, it's like yells. But like that fine
I like the yelling bacon too.
Yeah, yelling bacon. Maybe it's like bacon from the other room, right? So it's that sound that's like, it's like a hiss. It's like, it's got a little ring to it. It's like kind of pulling away that Velcro. You can kind of hear it. It's like if it's too dry, what will happen is you'll ink up your block, and you'll find that, like, however many times you print it, if your ink pad is dry, you're just going to keep getting this like really soft print, which honestly is an aesthetic. If you like a softer print, ink it down a little less, or put a little less ink on your pad. So once my ink is ready, I make sure to kind of move it around. I want to make sure that my pad is consistently inked, so that it goes consistently on my roller, so that it goes consistently onto my block. So I've got a nice kind of texture on here, a little denim-y, a little limey. And I'm just going to roll it on. I'm not pressing down too hard. I'm really just kind of letting the roller do its work, what it's built for. And I'm using a speedball roller. I like these. They're pretty simple, pretty easy to use. I use a firmer rubber. The soft stuff is fine. The extra firm I find is a little too hard. So these are just kind of the white rubber rollers you can get at your craft store. And I'm just going to kind of cross hatch it a bit. And I always have a side on my inking station where I take off a little bit of ink. It's kind of like painting where, it's like painting in that I remove ink and kind of can adjust, but I'm not painting it on the block. I'm rolling it on the block, which is giving me that nice consistent coverage.
Yeah, so, it's maybe worth pointing out. Maybe you can show the camera quickly just kind of how it looks a little more in detail. So,
you can see that?
Yeah.
It's a little dark. Yeah, and when you look at your block and you want to make sure that it's nice and inked up, you can hold it up to the light and you can almost see it glistening consistently. If you find that there's an area, like the corners sometimes tend to do this, the corner's a little bit matte, that you got to add a little bit more ink. If you find that all of your lines are filled with ink, you probably over-inked it, which is fine. You can always go in and wipe it away and start over again. So just for the sake of showing you guys, I'm working out of tight quarters today, which is a co-run gallery space. And I've got a press here, which is really nice. It previously owned by John Walson, and Eric Rewitzer, who was, again, my old boss from Three Fish Studios, is loaning me this very graciously. Not everybody has an etching press at home, so I'm going to show you guys this hand press, which you can get at any type of craft store. You can get it online as well. I think they're about 50, 60 bucks. They're pretty good. They do the trick. You can always also get a Baron, which is like traditional. So I've got your guys' cool stamp. I've got my little hand press here. I'm going to put my paper down. I'm going to put the little shaper made, nice and centered. And the hope is that my body weight is going to be able to transfer just the right amount of pressure. And there's a cushion in here, so you get a little give. Traditional stamps, they usually have that foam already implemented into the stamp. So we'll see how this one turns out. All right, it's not bad.
Oh, yeah, nice.
Yeah, so a couple things. What was that?
Yeah, go ahead. That was exactly what I was going to ask. A couple things.
Yeah, you're going to follow up the couple things. So a couple things are, we see that there's a little bit of a spot in here that hasn't been transferred, and that's fine. That happens. First blocks, like blocks that haven't been inked up, we call them thirsty blocks, which means they need a little extra ink sometimes. Sometimes they need like 2 or 3 to really get the nice, like almost like a patina on there to really work off of an ink base. However, this stamp is on kind of a hard wood with a hard linoleum. If we really wanted to get a really solid impression, my recommendation would probably be to put a layer of foam in between your linoleum and your wood, and that way, with my body weight, just like in traditional stamps, when you're a kid, it's a piece of wood, some foam, and then the linoleum or the rubber. It allows you to have a little extra give, and you can have more consistent pressure from your body weight as opposed to something like this, which you don't really have as much control over.
Right. Yeah, and maybe, Noah, if we come over here, I bought a couple different types of linoleum that I can show. Just a little bit of, because people may have not seen this before. So this is a, pretty flexible one here. This one is less flexible, I would say. And, maybe this is, maybe Orlie can speak to it. And then this one here is actually like super flexible. And I can even feel the give inside of the linoleum as well. So I guess the question for you, Orlie, would be like, is in this case where you're going to use for kind of this hand stamp or even a smaller press, we're going to use a softer linoleum, and as we kind of work our way up to a wood block print, obviously that's going to be much harder. Maybe you can speak on that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, the different types of linoleum, they all have different purposes and different things you can do with them. If I'm doing something at home, like, making gift cards or holiday tags or wrapping paper, I'm probably going to use the soft stuff. It's easier to carve. This is one guy that I did in the Easy Cut. It's called Easy Cut because it's easy to cut. And it's great for at-home stuff. For a more craft base, you can do fine artwork with it. The line quality is going to be different, though. The harder you get in your material, the tighter lines you can get, and the longer your block will last. So something like this, that's an easy cut, that's like super flexy, is going to be great, but is also going to take a little less time to start breaking down because of what it's made out of. Whereas with linoleum, The harder stuff, you've got a nice burlap back. It's nice and solid and firm. It carves much easier. It's going to last a little bit longer, but you're going to need a lot more pressure. So that's where comes in the press, or something like a hand press, or honestly a Baron, which is what a lot of folks will do. Is they'll have their hard linoleum, and then they will, go in with some nice Japanese rice paper, something nice and thin, and you can go in and you're basically transferring the image with your body weight, with your arm, slowly kind of making your way around the block. So each one's a little bit different. And then when you get to wood, of course, we're talking like really tight lines. We're talking like tradition for like years. Linoleum's pretty new to the printmaking world.
Oh, cool. Really cool. Okay, so that's the stamp. I want to quickly jump over to Jake, because he has a little more exciting project, and we're going to start talking about that one.
I do. So Orlie had an illustration that had yet to be cut, so we decided that we were going to turn it into a woodblock print. We had our people that assist turn it into an origin-ready SVG file, and I'm going to walk you through my process for cutting it and kind of the little tricks and gatyas that I ran into along the way. So first off, down here, I've gone through and I've cut the majority of, I've cut whatever I could with a larger bit and a 0.08 bit. So for this whole project, I actually used my 1/8 inch collet because it gave me a lot more options as far as smaller, more precision bits. And this is what I started off with to kind of hog out some of my material from this awesome print. But it won't let you get in all those fine details. So as I go through the whole project, I take out what I can to expedite my process a little bit, and then I come back in with something even finer, like a 32nd of an inch bit. So I'm going to show you what that looks like on tool, and kind of how I've in certain areas I will trick the tool into thinking the bit is smaller if it won't let me get into the area that I know I want to. Now this is much more applicable in a situation like this. I'm not looking for a perfect fit like joinery or anything like that. This is visual, so as long as it looks good and it's going to print, I'm happy. So we'll tighten that up and back into origin. As always, tell the tool what size your bit is. In this case, it is a 32nd. So 1/32 and Z-touch. Beautiful. All right. So as you can see, let's see if I zoom out a little bit. Oh, too much. You can see when I came through with that larger bit, it wouldn't let me get into all these tight little details around these parts. So, and once I switch to a smaller bit, it lets me get into those deeper points. Except for when we get to things like this. It's not letting me go all the way out because it's only giving you enough room for the kerf or the size of the bit. So again, since this is just a visual thing, I'm okay with fudging the numbers a little bit. So I'm going to lie to the tool and just tell it the bit is actually 0.01. I've already Z-touched the bit. The tool knows where 0 is, so I'm going to roll with that. Now it's allowing me to get a little deeper into that sharp line and cut all the way up lines like this. And that is going to, still some areas I'm going to have a little bit more legwork. The most important thing is you're consistent. So in this particular piece, there's symmetrical sides. So if I do this one and I lie to the tool and I tell it the bit is 0.01, I want to make sure I do all these elements that same way. But this one, for example, I can go back to that original true bit size. That's what that's going to look like. And I know that I can get into all of these particular elements just fine. So I will start by doing that. I'll just do a couple of them, and then I want to talk about another time-saving point after that.
I think Jake kind of talked about it a lot, but one of the really cool things about Origin here is, based on your bit, based on your offset, based on the file, you actually have quite a bit of control over this and can kind of make changes on the fly, unlike, traditional CNCs where you program things, put it on the CNC, and hope for the best. So in this case, being able to kind of manipulate that on the fly actually gives you, saves you some steps back to the computer or to redo it, where you can say, hey, I'm just going to, I don't actually care if this shape gets a little bit bigger. I'm just going to, make the offset negative. That shape will grow a little bit compared to what it should be, and then you can cut it. And, that's kind of a fun way to work on this. You can see, when you're doing these smaller bits, you actually have quite a bit more control over the shapes you're doing. But, as Jake mentioned, the smaller you get with your bit, the longer it takes to cut, the shallower you have to cut per pass. With Linoleum, it's not really a big problem, but as you're starting to cut into wood, if you're working with those teeny tiny bits, you're going to have a chance of it actually breaking, possibly, if you're pushing it too hard. You can see here, he's using auto locked again to kind of keep that speed the same so that there's not sudden changes to the load on the cutter and kind of directional stuff.
All right. So I'm starting to get that detail that I wanted out of these smaller, more delicate pieces down here. It's still leaving some material over. We're just doing this in 3/4 ply, so that we're going about 0.02 inches deep, just enough to get a nice print off of this. But I still have some material in there that I need to get rid of. Now, for those of you that know Origin, I could switch all of these different elements to a pocket cut, which allows me to freely hog out any material inside, or bring in the tools that know it best. Just save yourself a little bit of time, pop those elements out by hand, especially with plywood, because that top layer just wants to kind of pop off of the base layer pretty easily. You don't have to necessarily carve it. It's just lifting that and separating those layers of ply. And this is something that I had a hard time learning. It doesn't matter how pretty the inside is. So I'm coming here and just getting rid of that material. I just need it to be lower than that top surface so that I'll get a good print off of it. All right. So instead of sitting here, instead of cutting all these details, I think that it is important that we see what this print looks like when it's done. What do you say, Sean, Orlie?
Yeah, let's see what it looks like.
Should we do that now?
Let's do it. Yeah.
All right. So the finished project, something else we want to point out is we pocketed around each shape so that each moth was the highest point. Right, Orlie?
Yes, exactly. So I kind of cheated, and I already inked it up because I was so curious. This is like such a game changer when it comes to getting fine lines. So I inked it up already, and I'll show you. We'll print it together, but all those fine lines are going to be your highest point, and that's what you're going to see. And everywhere else around it is going to be carved away. I like to think of it almost like windows. Like you're opening all these windows, and those are going to be light, and whatever you leave is going to be dark. It's going to hold the ink, essentially.
All right.
Yeah, this looks great. I mean, the nice thing about it is that because it's on wood, and because they are just these isolated images, I can actually use this block as a template. So all of my graphics, all of my images that I'm inking up are in the center. And I have all of this space here that's carved away that I'm not going to ink up. So what I'll do is I'll actually be able to align my paper which is an amazing step to be able to skip when it comes to alignment and making templates. That might be one of the harder things to do as you continue to add colors to a block print. We can talk more about that later, but this looks great. I'm going to go ahead and ink it up.
Cool.
So I think another nice thing, though, of what you can do with something like this, I mean, if it were me, I'd probably want to cut it out so that I don't. I mean, the alignment is great, but also you'll see when I start to ink it up, there's going to be kind of this tendency to get ink in areas that are carved away. So while the depth that you've carved with the origin tool is like perfect for inside of the moth, on the outsides it's a little tricky because my roller is going to start to hit areas that are this kind of shallow but carved away area. So I would say, I mean, if it's possible to carve away a little bit deeper in those areas, how does that work with the tool? Can you change the depth of, the inside of the moth versus the outside?
Absolutely. We did it only at about a 0.02 depth, same as the rest of the inside of the moth. But if now hearing this, if I needed to make that deeper, I just adjust that to say 0.05 or even deeper if we just want to make sure that it was totally out of the way.
Cool.
Yeah. So for the sake of this, I'm just going to tell the tool that I have our standard 1/4 inch cutter in there, just so we can see that kerf. That's our outside cut. Currently it's set to a 0.02 depth. I'm just going to go ahead and change that to, let's go a little bigger, 0.1, and that is going to change for us. Now, to pocket out, like in that particular instance, I switched this. Oh, I'm sorry. I actually created a rectangle over the whole area and pocketed out this larger space just so that the moths were the top surface. So I can change that to a pocket. It's a pretty dense file, a lot of lines, a lot of curves. And now that's all pocketable space. Cool.
And while you're pocketing that, you'll need to make sure you kind of keep an eye on where you've already cut using the blue highlights to know you're not getting too close to the actual shapes, or you'll just blow through that.
Yeah, in this particular instance, I'm doing that visually, just to hog out that area around it.
Yeah. So going deeper is always going to be better on the outside, especially when it comes to inking, so that we make sure that our roller doesn't kind of dip in there. I'm very strategic when it comes to rolling my ink on my block prints. You always want to make sure that your roller is touching the entire area that you want ink to be on. So I'm never really straying in any of the areas that I don't want. So when I am rolling, I'm constantly thinking, like, how much of my roller is touching the actual moth. So trying to get as much of that surface area as possible. Now, even with that, I'm finding that I did get my roller on the outside, which is totally fine. It happens, honestly, with pretty much every one of my block prints when I do try and carve away that background. So I'm just going in with painter's tape, any type of like easy removable tape, and I'm just going and I'm kind of blocking it out. And what that's going to do is it's just going to cover all that ink up so it doesn't transfer onto my paper. There's a couple ways to print it. One way is you can print it with the paper on the press and then you put your block on top. Or the other way around, your block on your press and your paper on top. If your paper's on top, what happens is it's going to pick up everything because the paper is pushing into the block. So you'll understand kind of more of that once we roll it through the press. So I'm just going to, as quickly as I can, kind of get these areas taped up to make sure that I've got all of these like bits and pieces covered up, so it doesn't have all of these what we call pickups. The easy fix of this would be to cut it out into the shapes, right? So that all the moths have like an inch border around it.
Right, and at that point you just line it up by eye, drop it on the paper, and trust in your expertise to get it nice and centered.
That's what I would do. But that's also, I like to live life on the edge. You can easily build a template, even just like with a piece of paper that's larger than your final image paper. What I would basically do is I would measure out my paper, say it's like 11 by 14, and I would pencil it out, and I would find the center, I would put my block down, and I would pencil it out. So basically, you've created a paper template that every time should lock right in for your paper to go right on top.
Gotcha.
All right, got a couple little bits here. Want to make sure this first one's really pristine. This looks great. I honestly, the reason why I stayed away from carving this block in the first place was because of all of these fine lines. I love challenging myself to carve this type of stuff, but I would say I have like a 40% success rate, which I don't mind, but sometimes it can be a little discouraging. So it's neat to see, you know, with this specific graphic, you know, with all of these tiny lines, it would be really nice to see what my hand could kind of create. But having them nice and tight is like such a game changer.
Well, and I think there's a lot of room for hybrid approaches where you're doing, you know, part of it with by hand with the traditional tools, then also using Origin to help do things that take a long time. We're going to talk about a few of these hybrid approaches in a few minutes after we get this print done.
All right, I got one more bit and I think we're good to go. So I'm using, I think I mentioned it, but just to reiterate, I'm using a Conrad machine. It's a new machine. They're made out of Michigan. They're awesome machines. You can get them in various sizes. Like I said, this one is on loan from my boss. So I've got
yeah, and Orlie, I was going to say, walk us through this because I've actually never seen this type of press work done before. So I'm assuming there's others as well that would probably like to know a little bit more about the press in general.
Yeah, before I even get on the press, I'll talk to you guys about it. So this is an etching press. We've got in the studio. Basically, the etching it's a little bit more stable. So if you are to do an etching, which means it's a print that's been etched, scratched, it's not really carving, it's etched or scratched into metal, more traditionally zinc or copper, but you can also etch into plexiglass. Basically, this press has the capabilities of printing those nice etched pieces without warping or breaking down the metal plates. We've got a main steel roller here that's basically doing all of the impact work. So we're getting a really, really nice impression from this steel roller. We've got these two little handles here that tell us how high or how low our steel rollers are, and it's always important that they're aligned, otherwise you'll get an off print. I have it set right now for wood, but if I were to, say, print up one of my lino cuts, I would probably lower it. If I were printing an etching on metal, I'd probably lower it even more. Each type of print requires a different amount of pressure depending on the inking and the material that is being used. And basically the way that it works is I can print back and forth to my heart's desire, just as long as the press is calibrated. I should be able to move it back and forth. No problem working on one side, moving to the other side. For the sake of this demo, I'm going to be kind of printing it on this side or loading it on this side, printing it on this side. So do you have any questions about the press? I mean, I think it's kind of a unique little piece of machinery that isn't often used in spaces.
Yeah, no, I think the one question I would have, is someone who has Origin and would be interested in doing this kind of thing, is the press something in my, I can buy one of these for a couple $100 on Amazon, or are they quite expensive? if I wanted to do this, would I need to find a printing press somewhere in my city after I bring a block from origin to them and say, I'd like 10 of these, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So there's always a couple options when it comes to printing. When it comes to printing at home, it's tough to have one of these. They're big, they're chunky. You want to be able to use them all the time. And if you're only using a press once in a while, it's probably not recommended to throw down. I mean, I believe this press is probably 1,000, not hundreds.
Okay,
but
good
there
to
are
know.
other, but there are other options. I always recommend folks to look into their local community colleges, craft centers. Most of those places are gonna have an etching or a monotype press, which function in the same way. And it's a great way to engage with that community and see, every person, every printmaker does things really differently. So if you're carving something in origin, like why not take it to a space where there are other creatives to kind of share and work on that. So always recommend checking in places like that first to see if you can access a press before buying your own, obviously. If you are at home, like I said, you can use a Baron. Takes a little bit more time, a little more finesse. It's a little bit more frustration that comes with it. But once you get it locked down, once you figure out the right amount of ink, once you figure out the registration and the pressure, I think it's a great tool. A lot of folks still use this rubbing to create the print. And then, of course, I was using the hand press before. Yes, thank you for bringing that up. I just realized I didn't mention the felts. So these are felts. Basically, they kind of alleviate some of the direct pressure from the steel roller onto our block and create a nice cushion to feed the piece through. So you get the cushion, you get the ability to feed it through. And of course, there's another one on here to protect from stuff like this, which I think you can tell there's all kinds of garbage on there, which happens. So these felts are a little bit nicer. This one's a little bit less nice so that you can kind of protect the nicer pieces. And they're going to help, like I said, feed through and take off some of the direct pressure. Should we print it?
Yeah, let's see what it looks
please.
like.
Let's do it. All right, so I'm getting it set up, and I've actually already torn down my paper. I'm using just like Strathmore printmaking paper. It's pretty cheap, pretty affordable. It's already set to size. I love Reeves BFK. That's like your traditional fine art block printing paper. I think it's awesome. It's soft. It's like almost like cottony. A little bit harder to come by. You buy them in sheets and you can tear them down. So I would say play around with paper. That's honestly part of the fun of printmaking. The thin stuff is great. The Japanese rice papers create really beautiful prints too. And so what I'm going to do is, it's tough to see in this corner, but I've got a block that is the size of my paper. So what I'm doing is I'm just aligning my paper with the side of the block. I'm not putting my paper onto my moths yet. I'm just really getting my edges nice and aligned. And I'm going to slowly lower down my paper. And I'm not going to touch it after that. Once the ink and the paper have touched, that's it. If I try and pick it up and move it around, we're going to get a double image, have to ink it up, start over again. So I'm just going to get myself a little bit closer to the press here. My felts go on top. And this press kind of needs a little extra help. The bigger you go on these presses, the easier it is to kind of have them guide themselves through. So I'm going to guide it through a little bit. Once it's through, it's kind of on a geared system, so it's going to push right through it. I'm going to kind of pull it out. And basically, the steel roller has done all the work for me. What it's done is it's applied the pressure, it's pushing the paper into the block, it's transferring the ink onto the paper, and the hope is that we get a really nice, crisp, solid image that hasn't shifted. Shifting happens. Shift happens. I should make a block print out of that, actually. Awesome.
Beautiful.
So we got a really nice, crisp print. There are a couple areas that I can tell maybe need a little bit more ink, but that's just part of the process. If you can get it, nail it right on the first try, awesome. Usually takes me a couple times, like I said, when the block is really fresh. We call that a thirsty block. It probably needs a little bit of inking and running through the press, finding the right calibration on the press. But I would say that's a pretty decent print from a machine that carved that for me.
Looks really awesome from here. Yeah. So, okay, so one thing I think we didn't go over yet is a little bit of how much depth, like when you're carving, like maybe not the outside, we kind of went over the depth of the outside of the moss, but like in the inside of the moss, what's the depth that we need to go to so that the ink doesn't kind of touch the paper in between there?
Yeah, so with this process, it's not quite like other processes where depth changes, like for example with etching, if you go deeper, you'll get a really nice dark line. If you go lighter, you'll get a really fine line. With block printing, the depth, the most important thing is that you're just not getting ink on your block in areas that you want really nice and bright. That you're not going to create gray tones or mid-tones by leaving a little bit or carving a little lower. So if your fingernail can catch on it, I have really short fingernails, so I'm not really a good basis for this, but if your fingernail can catch nicely, then I think that that's a pretty good depth. But for good measure, it's always good to maybe double that. So you can get a really nice bright pop that comes through without worrying about whether or not ink is going to go into all of those tiny grooves that you've carved away.
Awesome, awesome. Okay. All right, so that's kind of a quick print that we created. As we talked about earlier, Shaper Assist created the file from Orlie's drawing. She just sent us kind of an image picture. Assist takes that image, converts it into lines and vectors that Origin can understand. So if you're looking to convert images or get files created for you, you can always reach out to us or go to shaperassist.com to get more info about how that service works. The TLDR is you send us an image or a drawing of what you want. We'll give you a quote for how much it would take to kind of produce, and then you get the chance to say yes or no, and then we will build it if you decide yes. But you kind of know everything up front, and then we do the heavy lifting of getting the digital files ready for Origin. Okay, so we should jump into a couple things that I wanted to point out. I know we're starting to get towards the end of it, and one thing that I wanted to go over, Orlie, is, I'd seen you had done a block print that was about 4 feet wide on Instagram not too long ago. Maybe can you talk a little bit about that and how you did it traditionally? Because I think there's some cool things that we can offer on a kind of a digital side that in the future may be useful, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Oh boy, that block was an experience. That's the biggest block I've ever carved, and in order to get my image onto my blocks, whether it's a small block of linoleum or an easy cut that's like 2x2 to a 4x6 block or 4x5 block of wood, my training is always the same, which is I'm going to create my image as an illustration. I'm going to pull it into something like Procreate, and I will do a digital drawing. I will inverse it, and then I will print it. No matter what size, I will print it on a piece of paper, especially with the large one, because it's tough to break that down into sketches. So I printed it on a big sheet of paper. I covered my block in blue ink, and then I used carbon paper to transfer. So I redrew my entire image onto my wood block. It was a journey that I hope to never do again. I know people do it and they do it really well, and that was just like such a wild experience. But basically that transfer process is setting me up to carve with then my hand tools, like I had mentioned earlier, so these power grip tools. So I learned a lot from that project. I was really excited to hear that you guys have a couple of really cool tips and tricks on how to still be able to carve something that large by hand, but to maybe alleviate some of that kind of crunchy beginning of getting your image set onto something that size.
Yeah, well, I think, when you have a digital file of what you're looking for and you're using traditional means to basically print it out. I mean, we had talked last night a little bit about how you printed it out on regular printer paper, stitch it together, flipped it to, get it to align, and then you start working from there. And, with Origin, you can kind of build the file digitally. Maybe if we go over to Jake's camera for a minute, lay out a bunch of tape on that surface. If you're talking a 4 by, 3 foot, print, you can just lay out tape all over that and start kind of laying out your landmarks. Really, maybe we are going to say like we are going for kind of a hand cut look. There's no reason we can't use Origin as the initial layout method and then come back in with hand tools, refine those, make them, look more handmade, but kind of skip that traditional step of having to do the transfer from a digital file to a printer paper back to another transfer. So I think that's a really cool technique that we could show maybe if we do another one of these where we're taking kind of a bigger file, showing how to get through there with these kind of hybrid approaches. Obviously, it also saves quite a bit of time carving out when you're trying to follow specific lines, and Origin's doing a lot of the correction for you, so you don't actually mistake. Because from what I hear, if you carve the wrong spot, there's not really any getting back.
Yeah, once you make that cut, it's gone. They're putties, but I think personally, from my experience, once you're in it, once you've made that cut, it is what it is. And the reality of it is that most people won't see that mistake, but it's nice not to have it happen in the first place.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's one other kind of hybrid approach that maybe people who are already printmakers or looking to get into it, where Origin can really help out, and that's when we're talking multiple color prints. Because once you start adding multiple colors, the process gets a little more intense. So maybe if we go over to Orlie, she can show us a couple of the, how that works and kind of explain, and then I'll kind of fill in with some Origin help.
Yeah, so I have a tough time with multi-block prints, mostly from the perspective of you have to think about your final image, and then you have to keep taking step backs and slowly filling in those windows that you've opened up. So, for example, something like this where I've created a graphic that is, a little bit more organic, and then I plop something on top of it, and I want whatever is behind it not to be green. So on the green layer, I have to go in and carve away all the areas where I have this monster's body and the shoes and the ankles. So being able to kind of do that in a swifter motion, the way that you would do something like that at home, someone like me who doesn't have Origin in front of them, is I would basically carve my first block, and then I would ink it up, and I would basically create an image transfer of what I've already carved onto the next block, and I would plop it onto the next block so I knew exactly what my image was, and then I would go in and start to carve away. Now, the trickiest part about the entire process of multi-block printing, in my opinion, is alignment. So how do you get your image to lock in to the next color and the color after that every single time? And the hardest part is you don't know if they really all lock in until the very end. So you've already printed, 10, 15, 50, and you've done as close as you can alignment, and then at the end you realize, oh, things are a little bit off. Which in my opinion, I don't mind. I kind of like the quirkiness of that in my work. But I do think that there is an opportunity with kind of being able to lock in an image exactly in the same spot on a block that's exactly the same size every time, which I think is really cool. And then the other thing I will say is with colors that don't really intersect or lightly intersect, like something like this, to be able to have, 2 color blocks that maybe you cut at the same time and all you have to do is lock them into place, is also kind of a cool feature that is tougher to do if you're carving something by hand and, going in with an X-Acto knife to cut. They don't quite lock in quite as well.
Yeah, no, and I think, one of the things to maybe talk about with Origin, and we haven't actually done this yet, but it's kind of a fun thing to think about is, when you're doing these, multiple color prints, you're either taking one block and kind of inking specific areas, doing a print, cleaning it, doing the other area, or you have multiple blocks to do each color if they're in different areas. And with Origin, we already have a digital file of the entire shape. We have the insides, the outsides of all the shapes. You can actually just modify the file so that each one would target different areas. So maybe if we had certain 5 shapes, we could cut out one shape of each block, and then they would all align because we have a grid feature. We can align to the edges of the material, quickly cut just the one, and then we can mark up or print up each one of those separate colors, have some fixture or jig that each of the pieces go into, and you would have really nice alignment with that without much effort. So that's something to think about as well for the future. Yep. Okay, well,
So cool.
I think, we went over a lot of stuff. The last thing I really wanted you to talk about is maybe can you give everybody a quick kind of, okay, I'm new to this. I saw this session, some really cool stuff in here. I have Origin. What are the basic tools I need to get started? And, let's work our way up to buying this big press you have.
Yeah, so it sounds like with Shaper you can do, or with the Origin, you can do wood and linoleum pretty well. So I would say the best thing to do is to get your hands on some good quality linoleum. You can get them at, like I said, any craft or art store. As far as wood goes, there are good woods to use and not great ones to use. So for something like this, you want to get a nice hardwood, high grade, like the good stuff, cherry, Sheena plywood, a really good quality plywood, a birch. Those are all going to be good hardwoods that will be able to take nice line work without chipping, and will last you a lot longer, and there'll be less pockets and bits and pieces. You don't really want to use salvage wood as much. It's just too unsure what you'll find as you're carving into it. So the wood, the linoleum, tools, if you are going in and kind of doing, editing, there are certain things that I think, like we talked about before, you can do really nicely with your tools. Like, for example, creating like these little divots that I know Shaper can do, or the Origin can do, but why do them if your tool can do them even quicker and
I
cleaner?
think that was the perfect example of when the tool is actually better than Origin is at a very specific task. So, if you look at these little kind of scallops, there's actually just a gouge that kind of creates that with a simple, movement with a hand. And, you can still do the rest of it with Origin, but then come in with the right tools quickly to do the right thing, rather than, trying to find the right bit that's tiny to fit those little pieces. So I really think this hybrid approach is a really cool thing, and I'm kind of looking forward to seeing some of the future work from you.
Yeah. And just to give you a kind of a quick loop in on the different tools, that's something that is used. It's this tool right here. It's a power grip tool. They're specifically for wood, and they're great tools. But you can also get kind of these palm tools. And like I said, the speed ball tools are great. They're better for linoleum than for wood, in my opinion. But yeah, I mean, these tools, they can create some really nice lines that are really quite fun to carve by yourself as well.
Cool. Okay, and then obviously, you need the rollers, just something that you can roll out the ink with. What type of ink do you like to use? Is it, just standard block printing ink, or?
There are all kinds of inks. Some are good, some are bad. I really like using oil-based inks, but they do require a very specific kind of cleanup, which is why I like the Cranfield Caligo Safe Wash. Like I said, soap and water will do the trick. And at the end, I'll just use a little canola oil to kind of spruce up my rollers to make sure they're taken care of and really cleaned. I always have a piece of, I got some nice tempered glass to roll my ink out on, but plexi works fine too. And then a good, scraper tool with a little flex to kind of mix your inks if you're mixing inks up, and yeah, a roller. That'll do the trick.
And quickly talking about cleanup, like as far as the blocks and the linoleums, after you're done printing, what do you do there?
Yeah, that's a great question. Each material is going to take water and liquid differently, right? Wood is porous, it's going to absorb, and the linoleum's a little bit easier. So with linoleum, I have no trouble. I'll spray. I have a little spray bottle that just has, my soapy solution in it, and I can spray no problem on my linoleum as long as I'm keeping my burlap nice and dry. We don't want it to curl. So I'll just get the surface, a couple of squirts, no problem. I probably wouldn't do that with my block of wood because you risk warping the wood, especially with those fine lines, popping off some of the little delicate pieces. So I would just take a rag and a little oil to start, just to see if that holds it up, and maybe just a little bit of soapy water. It's a piece by piece. And honestly, if you get it like 70% clean, you're probably fine. As long as you're not planning on, inking in yellow after you've printed like 30 black blocks, you should have no trouble leaving a little bit of ink on there.
Right. Well, maybe with Origin, you also, can, if something does happen, you can just cut it again. You don't have to do hand transfer, hand cut it again. Yeah. You can actually reproduce the same block exactly, which is kind of, I guess, one of the old scary things about wood printing in the past was if your wood warps, if you break it in the press, you start over carving. It'll never be exactly the same. And, that's kind of a nice, safe backup option here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, I think we went over a bunch of stuff today. Maybe Jake, you can take us out.
I certainly learned a lot today. I look forward to putting it to use, maybe even for the weekend, making some Valentine's Day cards. But thank you everyone very much for joining us here at Shaper Sessions. Thank you, Orlie. Take care, everyone. Thanks.